Welcome, everyone. My name is Aaron Broadwell, president of CSRO, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. At CSRO, our core mission is kind of around advocacy. We're representing kind of all the levels, state, federal, regulatory levels, and we're going to hear from experts in all of those different fields. We're going to be hearing from the government affairs team at Heart Health Strategies, our partners trying to keep a pulse on what's happening both at the state and national level. This is being recorded and it's going to be available on our website, csro.info. And as we go along, if we have some time for questions, we will get to that. And if you can put them in the Q&A, we'll try and get to that at the end. Without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce our first person from Heart Health Strategies, Matt Duckworth, and he's going to get the evening rolling. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Broadwell, and good evening, everybody. I'm Matt Duckworth. I work with Heart Health Strategies on the legislative side of our firm, which means I spend a lot of time with members of Congress on Capitol Hill and their staff, mostly from the committees of jurisdiction that handle healthcare issues. Tonight, I want to take a few minutes just to summarize the current events on Capitol Hill. If you've been paying attention at all, you've noticed that there has been quite a lot going on all of a sudden. As you're likely aware, we've recently seen the end of the longest government shutdown in United States history that lasted a full 43 days. Last week, the U.S. House of Representatives gavelled in for the first time since September 19th. They went 54 days without being in session. The House voted on a previously Senate-passed bill to reopen the federal government. And in that Senate bill, you had 8 Senate Democrats cross party lines in support of that legislation. The bill itself included full fiscal year 2026 funding for 3 appropriations bills. And that is what we call a minibus. You might have heard the term omnibus before. A minibus is just full funding for the fiscal year for a portion of the 12 annual appropriations bills. So that minibus included funding for agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration, Veterans Affairs and Military Construction, as well as the legislative branch or the appropriations bill that funds the work of Congress. Those remaining 9 appropriations bills have been funded through a continuing resolution, which is current funding levels or flat funding through Friday, January 30th of 2026. We're going to talk more about that in a moment and what those deadlines mean and what to expect ahead. But first, I want to take a little bit deeper of a dive into what, and importantly, who were the senators who broke that stalemate in the upper chamber. We notice an interesting dynamic among the Senate Democratic caucus right now, and that is that they are feuding behind the scenes between those 8 that crossed the aisle and the remaining 39 members of the caucus. It's really a public feud as well, as you had both the minority leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, and the minority leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, disapprove of the move to reopen the government. Interestingly, the 8 Democratic senators that broke ranks with the rest of their colleagues to reopen the government have a lot of things in common, but mainly they're either retiring from Congress, think Senators Dick Durbin from Illinois, Gary Peters from Michigan, Jeanne Shaheen from New Hampshire, or they're simply not on the ballot for the upcoming 2026 midterm elections. Now, this could lead you to speculate that this was a carefully calculated strategy by Senate Democrats who privately maybe wanted the government to be reopened, but wanted to publicly show that they were pushing for these Democratic priorities, especially around the Affordable Care Act premium subsidies and that run out at the end of the year. So they put their less vulnerable colleagues forward maybe as scapegoats. That's just me speculating, but I think it's an interesting dynamic nonetheless. One interesting note, I think, of all the senators and the way they voted is Democratic Senator John Ossoff was seen as a likely vote to reopen the government, really seen as a moderate in the Senate. And especially considering he's got a really high profile race in the state of Georgia next November, which has really become a purple state in a lot of ways with 2 Democratic senators, but a Republican governor. He clearly made the calculation that it's riskier for him to vote to reopen the government and potentially have it used against him in the Democratic primary than it would be to be able to tout bipartisanship in the general election farther down the line. I found that very interesting about Senator Ossoff. Now, the anger from the majority of Democrats who oppose the legislation to reopen the government comes from the fact that very few concessions were made by Republicans in the end with this deal. Senate Democrats were offered a vote in the month of December on those Affordable Care Act premium subsidies. But when you look back at recent history, a few weeks ago, Senate Majority Leader John Thune offered that same deal, and Democrats said it wasn't enough. It's highly unlikely that an extension is going to pass in the Senate. But I will say I was in Senator Schumer's office this morning, the minority leader in the upper chamber, and among other Senate Democratic offices that I visited today. And there's some recognition that a clean extension of those subsidies is unlikely to pass. And I think there may be a strategy. One path they may choose to go down is that they could load that bill, that promise that they got to bring a bill to the floor to end the shutdown. They could load that up with additional Democratic healthcare priorities and even other provisions, and then make Republicans vote against it. So things that would be popular in many different districts and states looking forward to the midterm election, make Republicans have an uncomfortable vote. I think to the point of it not that the ACA tax credits not being able to pass necessarily, Speaker Mike Johnson, who's in control of Republicans in the House of Representatives, has made no commitment whatsoever to bring a bill to the House floor, even if an extension were to pass the Senate. His members mostly oppose that extension of subsidies. They argue that these were emergency provisions that were instituted during the COVID-19 public health emergency. They were supposed to be wound down. That's why they had an expiration date, and that the cost is no longer justified. I will say privately, in the House of Representatives, especially, many Republicans want some sort of extension to the ACA subsidies because they're hearing from their constituents all over the phones in the front offices with people that I've been talking to this week after those premium updates. Premium increases have been sent in the mail and they've been received in many red states and red districts across the country. Although many of them want some sort of extension, I think they want changes to the eligibility criteria in terms of the level, the percentage of the over the poverty line that those subsidies would apply to. And I think they want a runway. Many of them want a runway to eventually wind those down to pre-COVID levels and eliminate them. Now, that is sort of how we got to where we are, but where are we going from here for the end of the year and looking into next year? Following that continuing resolution and minibus being signed into law last week, there's really two different deadlines to consider. And if we know anything about Congress, it's that they only work when deadlines are in play. The first is January 1st, the end of the calendar year. That's when the ACA premium subsidies expire. Again, it's unlikely that any action occurs before then. It may be possible, but when you look at the legislative calendar for Congress from now until the holiday season, you really only have about 2.5 weeks left of voting weeks. So there's not much time to cobble a deal together. The second date is that continuing resolution that went to January 30th for those 9 other appropriations bills. That date was chosen so that lawmakers didn't have pressure going into the holiday season on a year-end package, which they have often done in the past, where they could load the bill up with extraneous provisions and get it passed, because nothing is more powerful and motivating to lawmakers in DC than the smell of jet fuel around the holidays. Moderate Republicans, representatives in the House, though, have stated as recently as today that there is an appetite for some sort of deal on ACA subsidies for over a year. I think it was Representative Mike Flood who said he would consider voting for 18 months, for instance. So there is some conversation going on amongst Republican members, at least. The House Republican leadership, on the other hand, is in the process, with Steve Scalise, the majority leader from Louisiana in the House, is in the process of putting together their own healthcare affordability legislation. So far, it's focused on health savings accounts and potentially sending those ACA subsidies or a portion of them directly to Americans in some way, rather than putting the funds directly to insurance companies and then letting people shop using those funds for their own healthcare plans. President Trump last night, in classic fashion, sent a signature tweet out saying, in all caps, that he would not support an extension of the ACA premium subsidies in their current form, and that people should get those funds directly and then be able to purchase their own plans. If you zoom out to the big picture, and if you look at the history in the last decade plus since the signing of the Affordable Care Act in 2010, Republicans working on broader health reform packages have not had a lot of success. You've seen a series of difficulties in finding consensus within their own party of how to move forward. I will say the chambers between now and these deadlines are going to continue to work on the 9 other appropriations bills in the hopes to mark those up and get votes on them uh, before that January 30th deadline, which the government would shut down again at that time if we don't have another continuing resolution or a series of minibuses or an omnibus appropriations bill to finish out those 9 appropriations bills. And the Senate is really going to be taking the lead there because the Senate has the dynamic that appropriations bills have to have 60 votes, which means they've got to go out and find 7 Democrats to support those things. The work in the committees has been much more bipartisan. The funding levels have been much closer to current funding levels versus the cuts that we've seen in the House of Representatives Appropriations Committee. I will note Eleni Villanos from our team was in Senate Majority Leader John Thune's office this afternoon, and she learned that the Republicans are hoping to advance a second minibus, that's the smaller appropriations package, after Thanksgiving that includes a number of those 9 remaining bills, including the Labor and Health and Human Services Appropriations Bill, the Defense Bill, and a few others. Um, the last thing I'll note on this is while it's historically unlikely for a government shutdown to occur sort of back to back with a continuing resolution in between, like we're under now, the looming midterm elections make it a real possibility that we see some sort of funding lapse, at least for those 9 remaining bills, and we have another partial government shutdown at the end of the month of January. We're going to be on Capitol Hill on your behalf in the remaining weeks for this year, trying to gain intelligence on what's going on and steer policymakers towards our bipartisan priorities that we've been working on. And with that said, I'll be happy to take questions at the end of our webinar, but I want to turn it over to my colleague, Jessica Frasco from Heart Health Strategies, who is going to provide us with a federal legislative update. Jessica.
Thanks so much, Matt. I'm Jessica Frasco. I am really honored to work on Heart Health's team and to be able to serve for CSRO on both the state and federal policy team. I'm going to go over just a few of our federal legislative policies tonight. Right here, you'll see, for those of you who join us a lot, you'll see a familiar slide with some of our policy priorities. And we break these down into 3 different buckets. So the first bucket is how do we protect physician practices? How do we protect the independent physician and ensure that they can continue to practice in a really meaningful and productive way? And there are a handful of different issues that fall under that bucket, but you see 3 there tonight that we'll talk about later. The second is PBM reform. We recognize that PBMs are huge obstacles in your utilization management and in your ability to get your patients medications that they need. PBM reform has been a really major priority for CSRO. We've been advocating for both delinking, rebate pass-through, transparency, and even divestiture at the federal level for years now, but most poignantly, I would say since last December when we saw some of those provisions included in the end of year continuing resolution and throughout the rest of 2025 when those provisions were included in some of the reconciliation packages. So we shall see in the healthcare package that Matt mentioned whether there are opportunities for PBM reform, and we'll continue to monitor that and engage as there are opportunities for CSRO to really move the needle forward. And then the last one is utilization management reform. A lot of these issues that you see here are also issues that we work on at the state level. We work on them at the federal level because we need to impact the most number of covered lives. So whether that's impacting individuals through ERISA, which are those large employer plans, or through some of our other opportunities with Medicare, Medicare Advantage, and Medicaid programs overall, which are dually sourced by the federal government and by states. We're working across the board to make sure that those protections are offered to patients and that we're streamlining those processes to remove some of your administrative burden. I'm going to focus on 2 of those buckets tonight that we've been particularly active on throughout 2025. And the first one is really this idea of Part B reimbursement being diluted. And we see CSRO members and your practice partners as really having a handful of policies that are really putting your Part B reimbursement under threat. And so we're going to talk about some of those tonight. The first one is a policy called Most Favored Nations. And I feel like this has actually been getting a lot more press recently. You've heard probably about agreements that the federal government has come into with some of the pharmaceutical manufacturers. Those are voluntary agreements that they've made with Pfizer, with a fertility manufacturer, with Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk on their GLP-1 and on their insulin products. But what we've been seeing throughout all of 2025 is a potential for Congress to officially enact that through legislation and then through the White House to sign that into law, which would be a much more permanent policy that would then again have to be adapted and changed by Congress in the future. And so while those voluntary agreements that are made by the pharmaceutical companies and by the White House are still concerning, we're really going to continue to push to make sure that those are not enacted into law through an act of Congress. Let's take a step back and talk a little bit about why most favored nations would be challenging. Essentially, what happens in this proposal is that the federal government pinpoints U.S. Prices for select drugs or for all drugs based on a price of a most favored nation. And that tends to be a lot of our countries in Europe, Japan, Australia. And in doing so, would significantly decrease the cost of those medications. CSRO is a proponent for decreasing costs. It's one of the major missions behind every single policy issue that we work on. However, what we're concerned about is that when you are decreasing the cost of these medications and the ASP is then decreased, our 6% add-on rate or 4.3 with sequestration is then based on that deflated ASP. And so now all of a sudden the provider admin add-on rate is also decreasing. And so if the federal government and Congress and CMS don't do anything in order to address that discrepancy, we're looking at pretty significant cuts to the add-on payment that could make it really difficult for rheumatologists and their practice partners to be able to provide those Part B drugs. And so we have serious concerns with these most favored nations policies because they fail to address the way that physicians and practice partners are reimbursed. We have opposed the inclusion of most favored nations within the House and Senate reconciliation negotiations. We've continued to talk about these issues on Capitol Hill. We've had three really fantastic op-eds by folks on the CSRO board in Illinois, Michigan, and Washington. And we'll continue to be really vocal on most favored nations and how that can put providers underwater with their reimbursement. The next issue has to do with the Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Program. And so this is a program that was enacted through the Inflation Reduction Act under President Biden. In the way in which this program is created is that CMS gets to decide on a handful of drugs that will be selected for negotiation. And under that negotiation, the price will significantly drop for those drugs within the Medicare program exclusively. In 2028, Part B drugs will be eligible for that negotiation, which means that the selected drugs on that 2028 list for Part B will also drop precipitously. The challenging part here is, again, nobody has considered how that impacts provider reimbursement. So when the ASP drops significantly because of this negotiated price, which is called maximum fair price, then all of a sudden your add-on payment will also drop significantly. There have been studies that have been done by Avalier and by other notable think tanks, which have estimated that the physician reimbursement through this program, through the Medicare Drug Negotiation Program, once those Part B drugs are added, that physician reimbursement could drop by about 40%. And that is incredibly frightening for your ability to be able to be reimbursed appropriately, for you to be able to continue to offer those drugs to Medicare patients. It's also concerning, though, because we all know that Medicare rates are the baseline for which commercial payers base their payments on. And so if Medicare rates are dropping at such precipitous rates, then we can only anticipate that that will also happen in the commercial market. And so CSRO has really been active on this. We submitted comments earlier in the year when a provision called iPay was released in relation to this. We submitted comments expressing concerns about physician reimbursement. We've been major proponents of the Protecting Patient Access to Cancer and Complex Therapies Act. We're currently seeking support from Senate Democrats to co-sponsor that bill so that we can get that introduced and try and really enact change so that the physician payments can be carved out and we can preserve your ASP plus 6% add-on. That's really our goal at the end of the day. Through this legislation, really notably, it would still allow for beneficiaries to receive the benefit of those lower drug prices. The federal government would also receive the benefit of those lower drug prices, but the PBMs and some of the middlemen would be cut out of that, which would allow for the savings for physicians to be made whole. And we really think that that's essential in order to ensure that our Medicare beneficiaries can receive these Part B drugs locally through their private practice providers, through the rheumatologists that they've been working with for their entire drug life. So this will continue to be a really huge issue for CSRO, both throughout the rest of this year and going into 2026. The last issue I'm going to touch on really quickly, because my colleague Emily is also going to talk about this, but underwater biosimilars is another issue. And I'm mentioning it here because it's been a considerable issue in terms of, again, this assault on Part B reimbursement. We're recognizing that drugs are being over rebated, and in that over rebating, it's making it really difficult for rheumatologists to be able to administer biosimilars. CSRO sees the value of biosimilars within the market, bringing down the cost of those drugs, operating very similarly to how generics are operating in the market. Except because the reimbursement is so low for providers, we are not seeing an ability for our rheumatologists to be able to provide those drugs to their patients. And so we've been working really closely in a coalition that we formed with ACR in order to really address this issue, both through the regulatory process and through the legislative process. And my colleague Emily will talk more about that. The last area that I'm going to talk quickly about is just CSRO's work on the 340B drug pricing program. CSRO has been really active in 2025 on this issue. We believe that the 340B program is an essential program to make sure that individuals who are underserved and underinsured have access to the medications that they need. But unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of really flagrant abuses within the system, and those flagrant abuses are actually impacting private practices directly. Hospitals are able to basically buy cheap and sell high to the insurance companies and get reimbursed a huge delta in the middle that the independent practice will never be able to achieve. And that's because rheumatologists are not eligible for 340B designations. CSRO is not advocating for us to get that designation, but what we are advocating for is to create some more parity on the level with disproportionate share hospitals, which are currently buying up independent practices and making it really difficult through this 340B drug program that they have so much access to and so many funds to allow for independent practice to remain competitive in local environments. And so, as you can see on the screen, we've been really active in this space. We'll continue to be active in this space going into 2026. So on that note, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Emily Graham.
Thanks, Jessica. So I'm also very excited to speak with you this evening about what happened in the Medicare physician fee schedule. The physician fee schedule for calendar year 2026 came out at around 5:15 Eastern time on Halloween. For some specialties, I'm sure they felt like it was a trick, but I think for rheumatology, it was a little bit of a treat, at least if you are an office-based provider. Certainly a win there. So the contract year, or the calendar year 2026 Medicare physician fee schedule, for the first time in, oh, I don't know, maybe 25 or 30 years, we have multiple conversion factors. We have two. This is what was specified in the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act. The two conversion factors reflect your engagement in the quality payment program. So if you are engaged and you become a qualifying participant in an advanced alternative payment model, your conversion factor is a little bit higher. It would be $33.57 approximately. And if you are a non-QP, your services would be reimbursed a little bit less at $33.40. Of course, when you consider the fact that the conversion factor that you're currently under for 2025 is about $32.50. This is a significant increase. It's more than 3.25% higher than it is currently. So this is definitely positive news. The conversion factor update for 2026 reflects a couple of different things. So first, the big piece of this is we got a temporary bump as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act of 2.5%. Keep in mind, this is just a temporary one-time bump. This will go away in 2027 unless there is congressional action on the physician fee schedule. We are also getting a positive budget neutrality adjustment. That is not something that happens very often. Most of you will remember calendar year 2021 when we took a 10.2% cut because of the changes in evaluation and management services. This time we're getting a positive budget neutrality adjustment, and it is in large part due to an efficiency adjustment policy that CMS finalized as part of the rule. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But again, as I mentioned when I was discussing the conversion factor amounts, there are two different conversion factors. They reward providers by those that are in value-based models that are deemed advanced alternative payment models. So the conversion factor update for people that are QPs is 0.75%. And those that are non-QPs would get that 0.25%. Certainly, having any sort of an update that's built into the physician fee schedule is better than when we were under the sustainable growth rate formula. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that that there was a major policy in the rule that had created this positive budget neutrality adjustment. And when I talk about it in such a positive way, it's because for rheumatology, it's definitely better than the alternative. So this efficiency adjustment policy is basically where CMS is going to reduce by 2.5% the work RVUs for non-time-based services. That is things like surgeries and procedures. CMS, as part of their proposal, had intended to exclude time-based services, which they included evaluation and management services, so your office visits, as well as a few other services. The reason why CMS has put this policy in place is because they're of the mind that the current processes for valuing services are flawed. They are not capturing efficiencies that are gained over time by physicians, namely surgical specialties and proceduralists. And so they want to take a blunt instrument, which is a cut, and use that to basically boost primary care services, which is why they held evaluation and management services harmless. The good news for CSRO is that we completely clued in on the fact that they said that they wanted to hold time-based services harmless, because obviously if something is time-based, there is no opportunity to truly gain an efficiency. And wouldn't you know, drug administration services are time-based. And so we told CMS that they should exempt drug administration services from the efficiency adjustment policy, because not only are they time-based, but if we were to try and increase efficiencies in drug administration services, for example, by infusing a medication more quickly, that would cause patient harm. And so they completely agreed with us, and they did remove these services from the efficiency policy. So when it comes to office visits and when it comes to drug admin codes, as well as services that are delivered under Medicare telehealth policies and new services that come into play, those will all be exempt. Now, the other significant change that has a big effect on rheumatology is a change that CMS is making related to their practice expense methodology. The first thing I should probably point out is that the American Medical Association has been a key driver in collecting data and information that CMS has used for a number of years to put together their indirect practice expense inputs. And when I'm talking about practice expense on the indirect side, I'm talking about things like your administrative staff, your office rent, all of those different things that you need to have in place that are not directly related to the provision of a CPT or a G code. And so CMS decided that they were concerned enough about the most recent AMA PPI survey that they decided not to include that data. Instead, they're going to continue using data that they have been relying on for the past several years. Definitely a bit problematic to some extent because we always talk about using current data. But in this case, because there were challenges with the AMA's data, bias, low survey responses, it seemed like CMS was too concerned to move forward with that. But the really big change that has a significant effect on rheumatology is that CMS has decided that because we have told them, the physician community that is, that physicians are being, their practices are being purchased by hospitals and health systems, and we're, constantly being consolidated. And the AMA's data has proven that, there are more and more physicians that are now employed by hospitals and health systems. CMS believed that a way to help combat that would be for them to reduce the indirect practice expense values for services when they're delivered in a facility setting and return those funds and move them over to services that are delivered in a non-facility setting or an office. And so for rheumatology, because we are predominantly an office-based specialty, that resulted in a significant boost to our share of Medicare dollars by about 4%. If you break that down into facility versus non-facility, office-based providers would go up about 6%. And I believe the rheumatology practices that are facility-based would lose about 12%. So again, on the whole, rheumatology goes up by 4%, but depending on your practice location, you may be a big winner or you may be a big loser. The other big change that I just wanted to mention pertains to how average sales prices are calculated by manufacturers. As you probably know, there have long been concerns about how price concessions and how bona fide service fees are factored into those calculations. And so as part of this rulemaking cycle, CMS has put into place some new policies here, including things like defining what is a bundled arrangement, requiring that manufacturers do a better job documenting their price concessions and bona fide service fees. And when it comes to bona fide service fees, they want the manufacturers to be using a fair market value assessment in order to make the decision about what that service is worth. And they also have to certify that those service fees that are not being passed through and actually becoming a price concession. And so that could definitely make a difference for some of your practices in terms of how you receive, different sorts of information and services from manufacturers. The other thing that I want to mention is that CMS will also be including MFP units as part of those ASP calculations now. So those amounts for drugs that have been negotiated, that is going to be factored into the ASP file. They also have renamed the ASP file. It is now going to be called like the Part B drug payment file because it won't just be ASPs anymore. Also for negotiated drugs, there will be those MFPs. Next slide, please. So on the quality payment program front, just wanted to mention that we have at CSRO, we have long opposed a rheumatoid arthritis cost measure that was incorporated into the MIPS program, and it is now included as part of the voluntary Advancing Rheumatology Patient Care MVP. We have grave concerns about this cost measure because it penalizes clinicians for costs that they cannot control. There are so many different factors that dictate which drug you select for your patient. All of those sorts of systemic barriers, utilization management, step therapy, prior auth, the whole formulary game, non-medical switching, the fact that, several biosimilars are underwater, not to mention the self-administered drug exclusion list. All of these things play a role in your decision making. And this cost measure, which holds you accountable for resource use around your patients that have RA, are not factored in. And so we think that this continues to be just unbelievably egregious for the rheumatology community, and we'll continue to push back on this. And we'd also love to hear from you if any of your practices wind up being held to this measure, and it causes you to face a significant penalty or any penalty. We want to hear about it. Next slide, please. So as Jessica mentioned, there are a number of other things that we're doing in the space of underwater biosimilars. She pointed out that we have been having conversations with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services because we recognize that the real problem here is that the reimbursement is too low, but fixing the reimbursement challenge is definitely a bigger lift because there is a cost associated with it. And so as a temporary kind of fix, we have been talking to CMS staff and leadership to encourage them to make modifications to their Medicare Advantage and Part D regulations in such a way that they would revise their step therapy requirements so that there would be some sort of a formulary adequacy standard in place. And what I mean by that is it doesn't make a lot of sense for a manufacturer, or I'm sorry, for an insurer to put together a formulary and have a medication in first position that is unavailable by their network providers. And so we contend that it makes a lot more sense for them to put in place some sort of a formulary adequacy standard so that if the medication is unavailable to that practice, it's not something that they stock or are able to obtain, that the beneficiary or the enrollee can move to the next medication. So that continues to be in process. It's an idea that we shared with the GOP Doctors Caucus as part of the meetings that Jessica and I attended. And we are hoping to get them to help us convince CMS that this is a good strategy until something broader can be done with reimbursement. And then, of course, this self-administered drug exclusion list, we have been urging CMS to create some sort of a bypass because, as you know, once a drug is included on the SAD list, it is no longer eligible for reimbursement under Part B. In fact, it is excluded from coverage. And you've probably seen some stories about beneficiaries in the news who did not realize that their Stelara, for example, was put on the SAD list, and now they owe hundreds of thousands of dollars for that medication. And so we are trying to avoid more situations like that and make sure that patients that are unable to self-administer can have that physician-administered formulation. Next slide, please. So I would now like to turn it over to my colleague, Darcy McLaughlin, to give a state legislative update, and we look forward to hearing questions from you all at the end. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emily. Hi, everyone. I'm Darcy McLaughlin, and I help manage federal and state advocacy for CSRO. So we'll kind of get into what's been going on at the state level this past year. As many of you know, majority of the legislative sessions for the states have actually wrapped up for 2025. We only have about 7 states remaining in regular sessions. So there's still opportunities for some of CSRO's state policy priorities to still make it over the finish line before the new year. But at this point, we're kind of gauging our efforts and, prioritizing them there, but also planning for 2026, because with the legislative session, it is kind of fast and furious at the state level, with majority of the action starting in January to June. So it's really important for us to kind of do some of that early planning, which we've been kind of focusing on in the last couple of months. So as you'll notice on the slide here, there's quite a few similar priorities that you may notice that Jessica went over from the federal update. And that's because we're also working on them at the state level. CSRO's advocacy efforts are multi-pronged. We're working on many of these issues, not at the federal, but also at the state level, in case there's opportunities to kind of impact some health plans and alleviate many of the challenges impacting your rheumatology practices. So the exciting news is there's been a lot of significant wins on CSRO's policy priorities this past year. And even in areas where we didn't get things completely over the finish line, there was significant momentum, which is going to really help us going into 2026 to hopefully take those proposals over the finish line. So I know there was a lot of accomplishments this year at the state level. Given time's sake, we're going to just go into kind of 3 of the key issue areas where we've seen a lot of wins and activity by CSRO from its membership and also leaders this past year. So the first issue that we're going to discuss is PBM reform. This has been an area that there's been a lot of interest, not only by the Federal Trade Commission and Congress, but also state legislators, realizing that there's a need for greater oversight of pharmacy benefit managers. In 2025, we saw many states deliberate this, and there were some significant wins on PBM reform that we really wanted to highlight. And one of the reasons that CSRO has been so effective in getting its principles on PBM reform across the finish line is because we're not working alone. CSRO is an active member of the Patient Not PBMs Coalition, and we work with other provider and patient advocacy groups to kind of push our principles and pool resources in different states to try to take this over the finish line. So one example where we saw a significant win this past year was in Colorado. We saw the enactment of the first delinking legislation, and this is one of CSRO's key PBM principles, is breaking the connection between PBM compensation and drug prices. So Colorado was the first state to enact this, and that's really significant because it creates a precedent in other states, and we're seeing more state lawmakers now seeing what happened in Colorado, using it as a model or as a placeholder to enact in other states as well. One other state that we were really excited to see some action on was in California. CSRO was actively engaged in there, and even up until the last moment, we were urging California Governor Newsom to sign into law their PBM reform legislation, which had a lot of principles that CSRO really supported, and those were ensuring that there was a rebate pass-through model, that all drug manufacturers' rebates actually go on to the patient and aren't, going strictly to PBMs for their compensation. Also measures to stop steering by PBMs to their pharmacies or interest areas. And then finally, really strong enforcement efforts to make sure that there's transparency on PBM ownership, right? I think this is a very, we're noticing, and one of the critiques that a lot of lawmakers have is the vertical integration of PBMs. And California has a lot of guardrails and kind of enforcement teeth language in there that really strengthens the reporting requirements. And finally, one other state that we really wanted to flag where there's been a lot of great progress, thanks to not only CSRO leadership, but also members on the ground, is in Louisiana. Just last month, one of CSRO's members, Dr. Nashua, actually testified before the Louisiana PBM Monitoring Advisory Council on the need for more comprehensive PBM reforms. Earlier this year, they actually had passed a package which had some reforms in there that were helpful, improving transparency, banning spread pricing, but there was a greater need recognized by the legislature and the governor for more action. And the reason that CSRO was invited to testify is a testament to how strong CSRO is on the ground. Dr. Feldman and Broadwell have been instrumental in the state, along with other members, in building and cultivating those relationships. And because of that, CSRO was one of the first provider organizations called to talk about the need for this. In addition to those kind of in-person relationship fostering, CSRO has developed educational resources for many of the Louisiana lawmakers that'll also be used in other target states. Now, moving on to the other key issue that we wanted to flag at the state level is prescription drug affordability boards. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this is another area where CSRO has been actively engaged. Unfortunately, over the past couple of years, we've seen an increase in state lawmakers looking towards these prescription drug affordability boards as a potential solution to drug affordability and lowering costs for patients. And while CSRO will admit that in theory, the name of those sound really great and promising, when you actually kind of get down to the details, we realize that these boards are set up in a way where they're not really promoting affordability for patients and are actually harming providers and not tackling the problem. So CSRO has been really active and been working with a broad group of coalitions, such as the Value of Care Coalition and the EACH Coalition, to kind of engage in battleground states and educate healthcare stakeholders, the public, and also lawmakers and even members of the PDAB about, some of the implications of these. Most recently, CSRO had Dr. Feldman testify before the Colorado PDAB, expressing concerns about establishing an upper payment limit. And we've also, through our coalition, reached out to Washington State's PDAB. And CSRO has really, as I mentioned before, been a leader on this issue, so much to the fact that we've partnered with other patient advocacy organizations and provider organizations to host webinars in some of these battleground states to educate those key stakeholders. We specifically have done this over the course of the summer in Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. And I really want to stress, Jessica is going to get into some of the grassroots efforts that you all can get involved in a little bit. This is a true testament to why those grassroots involvement and getting engaged in your local community is so key, because of the great turnout from not only CSRO members in the state, but other organizations. We've seen PDABs kind of lose their influence. Less states are pursuing them. And actually, we got a huge win this past year. In July, New Hampshire actually dissolved their PDAB, realizing that the intended outcome wasn't happening and it was costing the state so much. So we've really seen a lot of success here. Unfortunately, Colorado is kind of the only state where this year it hasn't worked in our favor, in the sense that they did, despite much opposition, including from CSRO, move forward with the upper payment limit for Enbrel, but we're still fighting in other states and have kind of kept things at bay, which is a really great trend considering the strong support by many lawmakers the past couple of years. And then moving on, I want to flag just one more issue really quick where we've seen a lot of strong momentum this past year and some significant wins. Is with copay accumulator adjustment programs and banning them or restricting their use by PBMs. CSRO has been actively engaged on this issue. We are a key and leading member of the All Copay Counts Coalition, and we've been successful in advancing with that coalition and enacting legislation in Indiana, Iowa, North Dakota, and Maryland to ban or restrict copay accumulator programs, to make sure that drug manufacturers' copay assistance programs actually benefit patients and not line the pockets of PBMs. We're really excited. This issue has been an issue that a lot of lawmakers have been very open-minded to, and we've seen a lot of great momentum on this issue. I mentioned the 4 states that passed it this year, which now brings us to a total of 26 states, including DC and Puerto Rico, that have passed some legislation banning or restricting copay accumulator programs, which is a significant precedent and helps us in our future advocacy efforts as we try to convince more states to follow suit. I mentioned how we had some significant wins, but how there's still some states in session for this year. CSRO is still remaining engaged on this issue. We actually just submitted written testimony in Ohio late last month about legislation that would ban copay accumulator programs. There also is a bill in New Jersey still in play, which CSRO initially submitted comments on in June and is actively still engaging in. So those are some of the key accomplishments we've seen this year. There's been many more, but those are kind of the key issue areas where we've made a lot of ground. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jessica.
Thanks so much, Darcy. So you've heard a lot tonight about all of the ways that CSRO is getting engaged, and now it's time for us to talk about ways that you can also get engaged. I think the first is the CSRO Action Center. This is on the CSRO website, so go to csro.info and you can find the CSRO Action Center. Right now, we have only a handful of issues up because most of the states are adjourned, but come February, this will be very active and have lots of opportunities for you to engage your state legislators and then as well as members of Congress throughout the end of this year and into next. We also encourage you to check out the legislative map tool. The map tool has a host of valuable information, both about legislation that's been introduced in your state, as well as laws that have been enacted. And for the laws that have been enacted, we also have resources available for you on the map tool. And one of those resources is the step therapy resources. So if a step therapy protocol exception has been enacted by your state, CSRO has resources for you to better understand the law and then also to be able to submit an exception protocol, a protocol exception with the patient's health plan through this form here, and then hopefully be able to expedite that approval. If you are a part of a Rheumatology State Society, we encourage you to reach out to us and apply today on this website to apply for a state advocacy grant. We're excited to be able to support our state affiliates through advocacy days at the State House, through advocacy trainings online, or through in-person training opportunities. In 2025, we just had a fantastic virtual advocacy conference where CSRO members and practice partners got to speak directly with 12 members of Congress to discuss some of our advocacy priorities. In 2026, we'll be hosting the Advocacy Conference in Washington, D.C. on October 2nd and 3rd. And this year, we're adding an additional component where rheumatologists will be able to join us and meet with their members of Congress to talk about these pressing issues. So we encourage you to save the date and join us once registration opens. And then finally, we encourage you all to stay in the know. Please pull out your phone. Please open with this QR code the opportunity to get CSRO action alerts. They are state specific, so we promise not to spam you, but when there are advocacy priorities that Darcy went over or that the rest of the team went over where you can engage, you'll get an email specifically from our team talking about very quick ways for you to become a more active advocate for the specialty. And so we hope that you will take out your phone, use this QR code, and sign up and join us in becoming a more active advocate. And on that, we would love to hear from you. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and if there are questions, please enter them into the Q&A, and we're happy to answer any questions you have.
Awesome review, guys. Amazing. This is a phenomenal team for y'all who don't know them. And they really help us to keep our pulse on everything and keep all the advocacy of CSRO moving.
It looks like we have one question regarding telemedicine and whether telemedicine has been addressed in the continuing resolution. Matt, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so if you may recall, the COVID era telehealth flexibilities were actually extended with the last continuing resolution and did lapse during the government shutdown. They have been extended with the CR. They would fall into the Labor, Health, and Human Services Appropriations Bill, so they are not part of that minibus that passed. So the new deadline for an additional telehealth extension will be January 30th. I think that's something that we are likely to see in any healthcare package that comes together. It's one of the top items that is really has a lot of bipartisan support. I also think to much of Jessica's talk, we're going to see some PBM, bipartisan PBM reforms potentially in that healthcare package as well. So lots to look forward to. I think a lot of the thinking comes back to the CR that was signed into law last December, or that was proposed last December, and it was doged, if you will. Elon Musk tweeted about it, and all of the great healthcare provisions and PBM reforms, Medicare physician fee schedule fixes, those all fell out. I think those that is a good list to reference to understand what's likely to come about if a package is able to come together in a bipartisan way here before January 30th.
That's awesome, Matt. One of the other questions that we have is just about sequestration and whether there's anything happening with sequestration.
Not right now. I think that's something that lawmakers are considering. But honestly, there's just a long list of other things with a short deadline that they are working on. So not in the short term.
Great. There was a question in the chat pertaining to issues in Texas coming up in 2026. Texas is actually a really interesting state where it only meets for 16 months and then, or 6 months and then takes 18 months off. So we will actually not see Texas have regular session during 2026. So for most Texas legislators, they'll be meeting with their constituents in the district. There may be some special hearings or other opportunities where they'll go to Austin, but there won't be a regular session in 2026. There's some questions here just about the Medicare physician fee schedule and whether the gains in 2026 will be at risk in 2027. Emily, do you want to address that?
Yeah, and yes, they absolutely will be. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act provided a temporary one-time, 1 year, 2.5% update to the 2026 conversion factor. But unless Congress takes action, there is no additional bump for 2027 planned. The only increases that we will expect in 2027 are those tied to MACRA, which are 0.75% if you are a qualifying participant in an advanced alternative payment model, or 0.25% if you are not in an advanced alternative payment model and not a QP. And of course, whatever happens with budget neutrality, that's a fun thing, surprise every year.
That's great. There was a question here about downcoding. So Emily, I think that comes back to you again.
So we were able to resolve the downcoding conundrum when it comes to fee-for-service Medicare and with the Medicare administrative contractors. However, Medicare's coding and billing rules are not the same as their coverage rules. And so that means that there will be Medicare Advantage plans and private insurers that do not abide by the downcoding situation. We do have some resources. We can share with you a template letter that you can send to a plan related to downcoding on the Drug Administration service codes. I know there's also been a lot of concern about downcoding of evaluation management services. And I know that there have been some efforts, I believe with the PERT on that particular topic.
Yeah, so Dr. Feldman and I had a conversation with Aetna a couple weeks ago and just had some follow-up correspondence. They did do some clarifications that it is a limited scope, evidently, of people, and they stand by that it seems to be something legal, which we disagree with, but we're not lawyers. And then they did confirm that if you're getting downcoded, at least from Aetna, and you go appeal a certain number of them and you show that you are inappropriately being downcoded, you will be pulled out of that system and you should not get further downcoding for at least a year or two.
So on that note, I think we are just about at the top of the hour. Dr. Braba, I'll hand it over to you for any closing remarks.
Yeah, thank y'all so much. Heart Health Strategies, y'all are amazing, kind of really trying to keep all these things straight. And thanks so much for the awesome presentations. Thank you, everybody on the line. And please follow us, get our emails. We can try and get you active at your state levels as well as on the national level. Please see if you can come to the advocacy conference coming up because we're going to get you on Capitol Hill. Matt is a great tour guide of Capitol Hill. But thank y'all so much, and everybody have a wonderful evening.